Now, just a reminder before we begin that this video was brought to you by my lovely patrons like Cameron Strauss, Tom Smarty, Edward Pierre, Darathinian, Sloan, Cody Jones, and Loom High. For as little as $3 Australian a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Stormon videos, as well as access to bonus behind-the-scenes content. Link in the description below. Hey guys, welcome to our slightly delayed analysis of the 2025 Australian federal election. Now I'm here today with Aussies Elect. Do you want to say hi?
Hello, hello, hello.
So as you guys might remember, we did a similar video around the 2022 election, where we basically recount what happened over the previous parliament, how those results affected the election, so how the choices made in that parliament affected the election, and basically looking a bit into the future now the election has come and gone. So without further ado, Eli, let's go right back to the 2022 election and sort of remind ourselves what happened at that election. So, obviously, I think a lot of us, I remember because obviously a lot of us were scarred from the 2019 election when the polls were so wrong. We didn't really know what was going to happen in the 2022 election. But the result I found was, again, it was a bit of a surprising election, wouldn't you agree?
I mean, it was a surprise, but I feel like that election, unlike this election that just happened and then the 2019 election, the polls were actually mostly pretty accurate for that election. So as long as you trusted the polls for the 2022 election, the result that we ended up getting was pretty much what we expected. I remember there was a YouGov right before that election, which was predicting 80 seats, and then like Labor ended up getting 77. But I guess with that one, the Labor Party had a not the greatest campaign running up to the election. Albanese had a couple of gaffes, and it looked like, according to the polls, Scott Morrison had clawed back a bit of popularity in those coming weeks before the election. This election was pretty much the polar opposite to that.
Yeah, well, obviously we'll get to the election in a bit, but it's interesting how, like, with 2022, it was sort of felt like Labor sort of stumbled into a majority, mainly because the Liberal vote collapsed. But the other big thing, and the thing I think we were talking a lot about coming into 2025, was just how well third parties and independents did in the 2022 election. You know, obviously saw the rise of the Teals winning around 7 seats, the Greens won 4, and just, and like, I only felt like Labor was really lucky that they got a good result in Western Australia that got them their majority.
Yeah. Well, after that election, I think many people sort of talked about, like, possibly this leading to sort of the end of the two-party system in Australia. It was a very good election for the Greens. They won 4 seats, when previously for the last couple of elections they could only win 1. And then obviously there was that the whole Teal momentum, which pushed them into winning a bunch of which were very safe Liberal seats, and made the new sort of a political map very difficult for the coalition to seemingly be able to come back from.
So let's get away from the 2022 election and look into the 47th Parliament of Australia. Now, one of the things I noticed a lot about this term is, obviously, this is like the first post-COVID term. Obviously, the 46th Parliament was very much defined by spicy cough, as they say. But basically, by this point, I think a lot of the talk had moved away from the virus, and instead, I think a lot of it was on international politics. Obviously, we had the rise of the two major conflicts, those being Ukraine and Gaza. Did you sort of feel a noticeable rise in international politics? There was a lot more, conflict was arising and people were talking more about other countries than Australia's domestic issues?
Yeah, it really felt like foreign policy was moving away from, like, the typical dynamic of, like, worrying about the rise of China, and suddenly the focus was on these other conflicts somewhere else, a lot further away from Australia. And so it changed the sort of dynamics of how Australians viewed the world, and especially with the re-emergence of Trump too.
Yeah, obviously that comes a bit later on, but like I do think like one of Labor's first policies was to actually start jetting like Albo, well, especially Penny Wong, jetted around the Pacific a lot, really trying to build relationships with our local partners. After I think I would argue that Morrison and the Liberals did a pretty bad job, and I think we're kind of isolating Australia in the local region from other countries.
Well, especially with China, where Morrison had done a pretty good job of really souring our relationship with that country, and a lot of sort of trade. There was a lot of sort of small sanctions placed on us by China on imports into that country, and it seemed that Albo was able to patch things up a little bit with China.
So, one of the other things that's obviously affecting these regional countries was our attitude towards climate change. So, obviously, one of the big things has been like Labor actually, sort of getting Australia back into being an active participant in renewable energy. So, obviously, we've had a massive construction boom in wind farms, solar farms, and such. And obviously, we've seen the rise up of new power grids. Obviously, there's had to be a lot more cables installed across the country. How have you felt like the climate action has been received by the public? Do you think the public has been happy that we're addressing climate change drastically, or do you think it's been getting? Because I obviously know energy prices has been a point of high contention, and the climate policy has often been blamed for that.
Yeah, well, I think definitely over the last term, people have really started to worry a lot more about cost of living than the issue of climate change. Obviously, it is a worry for people, but they think that Labor are basically doing at least the bare minimum in order to address that. And I think that that has ultimately neutralized the issue of climate change for a lot of people, and it has made it a less salient issue, at least when it comes to between Labor voters and Greens voters.
So, obviously, as we know, Labor was really popular sort of around the middle part of 2023, because that's obviously when we had the Aston by-election where Labor became the first government in 100 years to pick up a seat in a by-election from the opposition. And then we also had the very strong results for Labor in the Victorian and New South Wales elections. How were you feeling at the time? Like, it felt quite like I think I was talking with you a bit. Like, this could be the first ever term where, like, in a long time, where the government cruises through all 3 years being above in the polls. Were you feeling?
Yeah. So you made a video around that time about sort of the death of the Liberal Party, right?
A video I thought was going to age badly, and then kind of aged like fine wine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, at the time, I very much felt like, this is looking pretty bad for them. And, we sort of changed our tune about, that opinion later on in the term. And now we sort of think that, that video, it's pretty accurate now. But, at that point in time, we thought, Labor could basically do no wrong. That they had so much political capital, and they'd passed the things that were very much needed for a while, like the NAC as well. Although it could be seen that the NAC didn't have as much teeth as as promised. That Aston by-election was a big one, and it really pointed to the Labor Party having a very solid honeymoon period after the last election.
A part of me wonders what Labor's results would have looked like in 2023 had that popularity been translated to the election today when they were at 40%. Because if they won 94 seats of 35% of the vote, you wonder what they would have done if they had 40% of the vote. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. So obviously, as we know, 2023, and I think especially 2024, was marked with what I would say is the decline of Labor's standing in the two-party preferred and first preferences. I think it sort of started with the Fadden by-election in the Gold Coast, where the Liberals got a swing towards them, although you could argue that's because the Liberals threw a ton of money into that campaign. But I want to sort of talk with you about what issues you thought brought the Labor vote down, and I think we are probably going to say the exact same thing, so I want to get your opinion on what you thought caused Labor's vote to decline.
Well, of course, it was the voice. It was sort of the idea that the Labor Party were more interested in sort of virtue signaling out these sort of progressive culture war issues than they were actually interested in making the necessary sort of difficult choices to fight the cost of living. that was ultimately what brought them down 5%, 5 percentage points on the primary vote.
So, like, I'd have to sort of agree with you on that, and it leads me to sort of ask the question: do you think The Voice was poorly timed, and had The Voice occurred at a time when the economy was possibly in better shape, it would not have been so negatively received? Or do you think sort of just these sort of very social policy focused things are always a bit of a election killer? Because I point to like the New Zealand flag debate that just before the Nationals lost in I think 2017 in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it was a really, really bad time for that referendum. They really shouldn't have done that at that period. And I have sort of challenged some sort of Labor supporters about like, why did Labor choose to do that? And they said something to the effect of like, Aboriginal elders were really calling for the Voice referendum. But I think that, everyone, including the people who were most passionate about the Voice, could have seen that it would have been more reasonable to hold it at a time when the national mood would have been more happy to embrace a socially progressive issue like that. And so I think it was definitely the wrong time.
But obviously, I think the Voice sort of just became a focal point. But I think the real thing that's bringing down Labor's vote share was definitely inflation and housing. Obviously, Australia has become sort of the poster child in the developed world of unaffordable house prices, more so than like I feel like any other country, and also inflation, which was interesting because it was strange how like inflation was high throughout most of Labor's campaign. And it was ironically when it was coming down when arguably their vote share hit their worst point. Like, do you have any sort of explanation on why, even though inflation was coming down, people were feeling more angst about inflation?
I guess like they thought that Labor wasn't doing enough to make inflation come down faster. Like, I know even though they were delivering surplus after surplus, the coalition were really prosecuting the case that the Labor Party were spending a lot of money on unnecessary things. And that's also what came with, the opposition to the Voice, because, that cost a couple of $100 million. So, you could argue that Labor was doing everything they could to really address the inflation crisis. But when people are hurting this much, it's still probably not enough.
So, obviously, I think the rise in inflation and obviously housing prices, especially the housing prices, caused a reigniting of the migration debate, which I think we're seeing across a lot of especially the Anglosphere, if not the Western world, where there's been a lot more talk. Would you agree that there's been a lot more talk about migration and whether or not Australia should cut migration numbers, or do you feel like that's always been a topic in the Australian discourse?
I really, especially you see it online. If you go on like Twitter or on YouTube, you get a lot of comments from people addressing, claiming that sort of both claiming both the inflation crisis and the housing crisis is caused explicitly by immigration, whether it's like the sole issue or if it's one of the biggest issues. And I've seen that most apparently in the last couple of years. And I really thought it was going to be a more of a swaying issue for people this election. It doesn't really seem like it has much, but
you'd have to agree, because the US election was clearly defined a lot by migration.
Yeah. I mean, Labor doesn't sort of necessarily have much of a illegal immigration problem. It just has a legal immigration problem. There's obviously a lot of international students and short-term labor that comes into our country, and a lot of people argue that, this needs to be decreased. But I'm not sure if it's sort of like a fringe group of people who are really worried about this issue, or if it's something that it is getting into the public sphere as a really pressing issue. It's just that it hasn't come into full fruition yet on making itself like the mainstream issue in the current political cycle.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, obviously we just think back to 2013 and the Boat People campaigns that got Tony Abbott into a landslide majority and such. It's interesting, like, whether or not migration will be. Obviously, I think that's again illegal migration, and we're obviously talking more about legal migration. It is obviously an interesting topic because, ironically, if it wasn't for the amount of legal migrants coming to Australia, we would have been in a recession for the last 3 years. So it's kind of ironic that like people get angry at migration when it's literally the one reason our economy is still growing. But
exactly, yeah.
Another issue that I'm not sure how big it was in this election, but it was definitely a big issue in some state elections was crime. Because in 2024, we saw the NT deliver an absolute landslide win for the Country Liberal Party, and then not as big, but still pretty sizable, a win for the Liberal National Party in Queensland, both off the backs of crime being one of their major focal points. How did you feel about the Liberals' chances based on their sort of elections in the two northern states or territories?
Well, just on the issue of crime, I firstly just want to mention that I think the main instigator of crime, in my opinion, comes down from cost of living issues, and whether or not the Labor Party has brought down sort of the inflation rate over this period, it is true that the cost of living has been a big problem over the last 3 years. And I think that does lead to sort of more, obviously it does lead to sort of more theft and stuff like that, but it does also lead to more sort of social tension. It leads to people acting out. It leads to more sort of public disobedience. So I think that's ultimately what has led to this crime problem, which is especially prevalent in regional areas. Regional areas have seen some of the highest housing growth prices in the last couple of years as well. But back to the Queensland and Northern Territory elections, both of these elections I didn't think too much of as like as strong implications for the federal Labor Party, even though they did have some pretty big losses in both of these elections, because both of these elections had a pretty big like it's time factor. These state Labor governments had been in for quite a while, and when that happens, you do see a swing against them, especially when they're going into like their third or fourth term.
I would agree that like I didn't think too much of the NT election because Labor there was in kind of a bit of a mess. Queensland was interesting though, because I think one thing you might have noticed about the Queensland election is the fact that Labor was able to bring what was supposed to be a landslide win. Well, it sort of ended up being a landslide win, but they were able to bring a lot of there's a bunch. I would say there's about 5 seats that they won at the last moment by pulling off a bit of a surprise swing in the last few days of the campaign. Did you take much note of that? Because obviously, I think you noticed straight after Stephen Miles basically. Sort of saw a swing in his favour at the end. Albo sort of started copying him. I think that's when he announced his big like student hex like repayments on hex debts. He offered to cut people's hex debts.
Oh yeah. So I have 2 things to say about that election. The first one is that I think what really saved the Liberals was pre-polls. It seemed that the longer Stephen Miles sort of went into the campaign, the more popularity he built. And on the night, we thought that like maybe the two-party preferred would be something like, I don't know, only like 51-49 to the LNP, but it ends up being like more like 54. And that's because I think once pre-polls came in, votes from earlier in the campaign, that's when the LNP was able to take a lead in more places. But the other thing I noticed also in that election was that the metro area of Brisbane barely swung at all to the LNP. It was really only Capalaba, I think, that the LNP picked up in the metro area of Brisbane. So I think that sort of maybe foreshadowed the kinds of results that we would see in the federal election as well.
So, obviously, as we were coming to the end of 2024, I know a lot of people, and those probably just right-wingers wish casting, were really hoping Albo would go to an early election. But as we know, he did go full term. And I think some people were noting he was the first party leader to go full term in his first term in office. I think Turnbull, Rudd, they'd all sort of called an election 6 months or so earlier than needed. In Rudd and Abbott's case, they didn't even make it to a full term. But as a result, we obviously saw some new things occurring in 2025 as we went into the election. I think the first one, I don't think we realised it just that much at the time, was Trump's return to the White House in the US. This is something that I know, obviously, if you watch a lot of American commentators on the Australian election, they'll put a lot of focus on Trump, obviously because they're American. How did you feel about Trump getting elected? This is before he necessarily got into power, but in the sort of the lame duck period of Biden's administration. How are you feeling about Trump potentially returning to the office? Do you think that would have much of an impact on the Australian election at the time?
Yeah, well, when Trump did inevitably win that election last year, 2024, the betting markets reacted really heavily, flipping basically so that the coalition in Australia were now the favourite. So there was this sort of attitude that the world was turning on progressivism, stuff like sort of DEI, those progressive culture war issues. And I think that really sent a message to the Labor Party that they had to make the upcoming election on the economy. It had to be on economic issues. They really could not. They had to turn the political narrative away from these sort of culture war social issues and make it all about the economy. And that's how they would win the election. And also that they would have some solid sort of policies that would really make people want to vote Labor as well. And then you saw the coalition mimicking a lot of the sort of Trump lingo or ideas in like the late part of 2024 and early 2025. You saw Jacinta Price wearing a Make America Great Again, like Christmas beanie. And then you saw like Michaelia Cash in early 2025 saying that Dutton would have the exact same attitude as Donald Trump. So there was this embracement of sort of Trumpism by the coalition. And then when things turned sour in 2025 with Donald Trump and his effects directly led to people's super crashing in Australia, that's when the coalition knew, oh, okay, we have to get the hell away from being associated with Donald Trump.
It's really fascinating because I've currently got the two-party preferred for the election just gone. And it's fascinating that literally in October or like in November when Trump gets elected, you can actually see the Liberal Party's vote share going up. And then it peaks exactly around January when Trump is inaugurated. And that's when it starts swinging down. It's fascinating how literally perfectly it lines up with Trump getting elected and Trump assuming office.
Well, I think the more sort of turning point was the event with Zelensky and Trump in the White House with that argument between them, because it just really showed that Trump was not the nicest person. I think it just reflected really badly on Trump's character, and it showed to the Australian people that this is not the kind of person that you might not want to be leading the country. And then again with Michaelia Cash saying that Dutton would have the exact same attitude, that reflected really badly on the coalition.
So let's obviously move forward to March, where we had another state election, this time in Western Australia. Now, the Western Australian election is kind of strange because by all metrics, Labor had almost a 20% swing in their first preferences and a 12% swing against them in their two-party preferred. But because the previous election they had been such a monumental landslide, it only resulted in 7 seats being swung, and they still ended with still the second largest majority in Western Australian history. It's a bit hard to read from that election. I think most of us took it as a bit of a dud election for the Liberals, despite theoretically those sort of swings being incredible.
Well, the swings sort of were in the regions where the Nationals did pick up a couple of seats, the WA Nationals, who aren't actually in coalition with the Liberals in WA or with the federal Liberals in WA. And then the swings were also sort of in the outer suburbs where Labor had these massive margins, so they weren't actually going to affect things. But especially in the sort of inner suburbs, in the metro area of Melbourne, the metro area of Perth. Yeah, I know. The metro area of Perth, the Liberals really fell pretty flat. They made only a couple of gains. It was a pretty underwhelming election for them there, even though, as you said, there was this 13% swing on the two-party preferred.
So obviously, yeah. So it's very interesting, but it did feel like there was potentially momentum building for Labor. Like obviously, this like Roger Cook, despite being obviously a new phase, because obviously Mark McGowan had just resigned like a year or two earlier. The fact that he was able to do so well, I think maybe was giving Labor some hope that they could pull off a win. And as we said, I think we can't understate how much Trump was affecting the election as Labor sort of began to really start building a lead again in the polls.
Mm.
So
But
let's
there was
actually,
also, sorry, I just want to mention, there was also sort of some economic factors that led to sort of a bit of a rise, I think, in Labor's popularity towards the end. There was things like in December of 2024, we finally entered a quarter of per capita economic growth, and then we also had the interest rate cuts. The interest rate cut in March, and I think it was definitely
it was interesting
yeah
because
March.
we were talking a lot about that interest rate cut and how much of an
Mm.
impact it would have. Like, a part of me was kind of like, is an interest rate as one little? It was a really small one too, but like, obviously, I don't know if like people were really passionate about interest rates or if the government was
Well,
able to sell it well.
I think I think it just showed that there's a possibility that Australia's economy was turning a corner, and therefore the economic narrative that the Labor Party um, were dressing up as a quote unquote soft landing. There was truth in that, and they entered a lot more trust in the economic proficiency of Jim Chalmers, and they could keep on going on and on about delivering two surpluses and what the inflation rate was when they came to office compared to what it was when they were leaving office. Well, sorry, at the end of the term. So that it just showed that even though the cost of living crisis was still there, maybe Labor were really addressing it.
So obviously, let's get forward to April, and Albo obviously calls the election for the 3rd of May. And at that point, the polls had really narrowed up to the point where basically I would say that I think I was sort of I was 75% confident Labor was going to retain their majority with maybe either the same or a few more seats, and maybe 25% thinking that we were going to get a Labor minority. But I think, I'm not sure about you, but I was pretty confident Labor was going to win this election.
Yeah,
The question is, could they
unless
maintain the
things
majority?
unless things turned around a lot, it really looked like Labor Party was going to win, whether it was in a minority or a majority. And there was a sort of a question about like if there would be more scrutiny on the Labor Party as the campaign progressed forward. Maybe people would see that the Labor Party didn't really have like radical or strong agenda to take the election, and maybe people would vote against them because they were demanding like big changes to the economy. But we didn't really see that. In fact, there was a lot more scrutiny on the opposition in the weeks coming up to the election. Peter Dutton started to be asked a lot of questions about his policies, and as you'll probably talk about, Dutton ended up on flip flopping and backtracking on a lot of the policies that some of them he had for quite a while.
It's interesting because we were talking a lot about how, like, even back in 2022, like when we did this video last time, we were both pretty sure that Dutton was not a good choice for opposition leader, both due to the fact that
Yeah.
he is quite far to the right, and also he's not a very appealing figure. Like,
No, that's
he's
right.
always come across as, his place has always been as a hard right man of politics. Like, he's like, I'm the big tough guy, so you don't have to be. And that's never really something that's attractive to, I think, a lot of people.
Yeah, he's got this deep, booming voice, and he has this very sort of like strongman image to him, and it feels like he leans into that a lot, that strongman image, to the effect that like people rarely ever see rarely ever see a lot of sort of humanity or sort of empathy
And
in his attitudes. And I think with him sort of flip flopping, going back on policies such as working from home, the only sort of strength that he had, that he was a strong leader, even that was deteriorating because people could see that he was willing to drop things he really stood for in order for political gain. So the only thing he had really working for him he was losing it as the weeks went by.
So it's interesting about that because, in my opinion, the working from home policy, as we'll probably talk about later, I think that was the number one thing that brought his campaign to the ground. Just because, sure, he was like, oh, it's only just for Canberra public servants, which, for a start, that doesn't alleviate people because, people have friends and family in Canberra, and, like, why are you being mean to them?
Well, at first they weren't even saying it was just Canberra. At first they were saying it was every public servant.
Yeah, and then they're like, the private sector's going to follow suit if you do this. And so, like, women who, work from home's been amazing for them because it means they can look after their kids at home while still doing their job. Like, I think that's one of the big reasons he lost women so badly, let alone the coalition's already pre-existing women's problem that we'd identified at past elections.
Yeah, and again, like flip-flopping on that, like, sure, it might have saved him votes, but a lot of people already thought that was their policy, and they didn't believe them, and they didn't believe him when he said that he wasn't doing that anymore. So I think they might as well should have just gone like full speed on it and really sort of made it sort of like a culture war on public servants, but they didn't even do that. Of course,
and I think, but that also I think helped put to the divisive rhetoric of it, because I think this is the same problem we saw in America, where the Democrats went for like a hyper specific voter group, and then lost to arguably the party pushing the more general message. And I think that's the same problem the Liberals had in this election, is they was really targeting the outer suburbs. That was always their main thing, is the outer suburbs of cities. That's where we're going to win. But I think, ironically, they lost to a more generalistic message. Would you agree with that on hyper-targeting?
Well, I think they had the worst of both worlds, where not only did they lose those stay-at-home public servants, but then they also lost the people that really had faith in Peter Dutton, that he was going to be this strong, decisive leader who really believed in what he said. And in the end, nobody really trusted him on anything, really, because they just didn't believe in anything the coalition could stand for when they were willing to flip-flop on an issue which especially when it came to like cutting the public service as well. He'd had that policy, I believe, since the 2024 budget reply. So he had that policy for a while, and he was willing to sort of backtrack on that weeks before the election. It just seemed like he was really untrustworthy with that. So with those kind of decisions.
So along with the work from home policy, the other big thing, and I'm not sure how much this impacted the election, was the nuclear policy. The idea that the coalition was going to quite an ambitious policy. It was more than just remove the ban. It was basically a massive investment to make Australia a nuclear power. How much do you think that affected the election?
Yeah, again, that was that thing where the coalition had that for a long time, that policy, but it seems in the weeks before the election, they weren't willing to sort of stick by it and really willing to advertise and say the benefits of it all. And they also weren't willing to find a way to pay for it either. Like, it's a big costing policy, and the coalition are never really willing to do anything about tax reform. They're not willing to ever say, okay, well, we're going to increase taxes on X, Y, and Z to pay for this groundbreaking thing. And so they really had no way of selling this policy, and they really had to backtrack on it, but they couldn't dump it entirely, because then again, like, Dutton would seem incredibly weak. So they sort of half-assed it, and it became this really central point of attack from the Labor Party, which it always would have been, because nuclear does scare a lot of people. So that was a massive blow to the coalition, that policy.
So let's jump forward to the actual election itself and sort of think about what we were sort of feeling at the time. Because I think obviously a bunch of you guys at home who are watching us during the live stream election coverage would know just how shocked we were at the results. Like, we were sort of predicting Labor maybe could win a few seats, but like when we started seeing like all the seats in like Brisbane start falling, and a bunch of like safe Liberal seats in Sydney and Adelaide also sort of fall, like what was your sort of your feeling at the time when you saw this? Like, was it like, oh, we should have seen this coming, or was it still very much a bit of a surprise?
It was absolutely a surprise. Like, I really thought, especially in Queensland, that even though Dutton was not the most appealing character, he would at least appeal to the people that live in his home state and live in his area too. But it seemed like sort of the closer an electorate was to where Peter Dutton lived, that's where the swings were the hardest, or at least those. I mean, Labor didn't win Longman, but Labor picked up like seats like Petrie,
Ford.
Ford, and Bonner. Right? Wait, is it Bonner? Yeah,
Yeah, it's Bonner.
And Bonner, and then also made gains in some of those green seats as well. So that was a huge surprise. Like New South Wales, like I guess I sort of Banks and Hughes were also obviously a big surprise as well. But just the fact that his home state turned against him. Do you think that was because of the floods, or what do you think that was from?
I don't know exactly what caused the swings in Queensland. There was some arguments that like maybe Queensland didn't mind how Labor had governed, and like now they'd seen the 3 years of Labor government, they thought they were better than the Liberals, or maybe they didn't. Maybe they thought that just like everyone else, they just thought Dutton was a bit too flip floppy and didn't seem to know what he was doing. Like, it's really hard to say because like Queensland was something that just came out of nowhere because we had all written off that state. Actually, I will admit, it's been kind of funny because I'm the kind of guy who's been predicting Labor wins in Queensland for like the last few years, and now the first election I finally give up on it is when it happens. So take of that what you will.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the first gains that the Labor Party have had in Queensland since I think 2016. Even that election, I don't think
they gained like two.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it was big. Like I was expecting Labor to sort of never break through in Queensland. I thought just Queensland had sort of had enough of Labor.
It's weird because Brisbane's basically fallen into parity with all the other mainland cities. It was like the one city in Australia, outside maybe the Gold Coast, where the Liberals have a presence, whereas every other city has no Liberals whatsoever really anymore.
Right, yeah, exactly, yeah.
So, what's interesting, another thing to talk about this election is we were also predicting at the 2022 election the rise of third parties. Now, strangely, third parties actually got a larger vote share at this election, despite the fact that Labor won a 90-plus seat majority. Like, how do you feel about that? Like, technically, the independents did grow. They just didn't.
Well, I guess it wasn't sort of centralized enough in geographic areas, and that's what you need to win in these sort of like single member electorate sort of system that we have in Australia. And when it came to the Greens, I mean, we could make a full video just about like what the hell happened with the Greens, but the Greens definitely went backwards, even if you could say that the Greens mostly lost in Griffith and Brisbane because of the collapse of the Liberal vote.
So we had some strange results in places like Goldstein, which is weird because obviously the coalition was going for outer suburban seats, and ironically the one city seat they won was an inner metropolitan seat in Goldstein. I guess we can't really talk too much about like a single seat and if that means anything. Do you think Goldstein is potentially a sign that the Liberals, because they obviously did pretty bad in the inner Sydney seats against the Teals?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess a lot of people have made about like the whole like, you know, Gaza, Israel thing, if that could have sort of caused that. But I do think that the Liberal Party really seemed to spend a lot of money on especially the seats of Goldstein and Kooyong. And those were a couple of places that there was a swing actually towards the Liberal Party. And then there was also that sort of exclusive Brethren people that they seemingly hired to do their dirty work in those seats as well. So the Liberal Party were really adamant about winning those seats back, and they probably took away resources from defending against Labor challenges in some other seats in order to win those back. So it seems like the Liberal Party really do have something against the Teals, and they really want to stop them invading seats they believe to be theirs at all costs.
So it's interesting. We could argue that because like it's been interesting to see how Labor, because obviously Labor failed to take back Fowler at this election. I think they might have actually got Daly might have got a swing towards her, and obviously we also saw the independents potentially winning in Bean as well in South Canberra, which is definitely something none of us saw coming. Like I and also reminder that Labor only got 35% of the first preferences, so I don't think this election is a sign that the third party movement is dead. I do think there is very much a possibility that we could see a minority government at the next election, just because if a few of these independent candidates finish second or something, we could suddenly see them jumping Labor in a ton of the seats that they won this election. Do you see that, or do you think Labor's pretty solid in in being able to maintain a majority next time round?
Oh, look, I don't think it's really that wise to predict exactly what's going to happen at this point in time in the next election, because really anything could happen at this point. But it does put some of these independents, even against coalition seats as well, like in a pretty good position next election. Like a lot of them only just lost. Like you mentioned, Bean. Some of the other ones are like Forrest in WA,
Flinders in Melbourne.
Yeah, and then Franklin in Tasmania. That was a pretty good challenge as well. Pretty far off, but a good challenge as well. And then Fremantle, of course, that Labor challenger as well, did pretty well. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for independents, but generally they all just kind of missed out this election, and that's why we're seeing sort of the crossbench sort of stagnate, even though we have seen the rise of independents and third parties in the national primary vote.
So just before we move on, I did want to mention one other thing, which was the interesting underperformance of the One Nation Party. Going into the election, as the Liberal vote was declining, we saw an increase in what looked like the One Nation vote. I know it led to you to suspect that a lot of seats might become a Labor One Nation contest, and One Nation could be battling for seats and Senate spots in multiple states. But they surprisingly underperformed, and it's been sort of a message I haven't really seen much of the media covering, just how badly One Nation did. I'm looking at their polling, and they came like 2% down underneath their average. How do you find that? Because generally One Nation's been outperforming polls quite often.
Yeah, well, this is the thing I said earlier about immigration, and that's why I believe the polls. A lot of the polls are pointing to these massive primary votes for One Nation getting something like 8, 9, 10% nationally, and yeah, so One Nation only got like 5.5% or something like that. So it really showed that while immigration was a issue, One Nation did get a swing towards them. It isn't quite the issue that's on the lips of most voters, I feel, or at least they think that Labor's doing a good enough job to sort of tackle the issue of immigration. So yeah, I would say it was an underperformance by One Nation at this election.
So let's go on to looking a bit of where we go from here. One of the things I was thinking about this week is just how much the perception of Albo has changed the Prime Minister. Because going into this election, I think a lot of it he came across as a bit of that bumbling, friendly Labor guy that kind of just happened to fall into first place at the last election. But he really does leave this election as an absolute political juggernaut. Would you agree with that? My perception of Albo has drastically changed since before the election.
Yeah, like a lot of people are saying he's like the Labor Party John Howard. I mean, John Howard had 4 terms or something like that, so that's predicting a lot for...
Did I not say that at the last election, didn't I?
Yeah, you did say that, yeah. So you started that trend. So, I mean, we don't know how Albo is going to do from here, but, he's had a really good election and he's become basically this Labor Party superhero. I think he's done the best that the Labor Party's ever done since the 1940s. So you could say that probably things are on the up and up for him from here. But I do really think that the Labor Party, some way or another, I don't know if they go to an early election or not, but somewhere or another, they have to sort of up the ante when it comes to sort of some kind of radical or at least sort of stronger agenda, probably in the area of tax reform. And if they don't do that, I think that sort of image of weakness will return to Albanese if he isn't too careful.
We'll talk a little bit about what could possibly bring down the Labor government in 2028. But one of the things I want to talk a bit about is just some policy differences that we could be seeing. One of the things I've mentioned, I've watched a few videos on, is the pivot to Asia. This was a move started, I think, mostly by Keating to basically move Australia away from its traditional American focus and instead focus on the local region. And we noticed that one of Albo's his first visit after being re-elected was to visit Indonesia. Do you think after Labor sort of bullied into supporting the US with AUKUS and stuff, do you think we possibly could be seeing a pivot back to Asia like Keating would have wanted?
You mentioned AUKUS, and the Labor Party are very sort of strong on maintaining AUKUS. That's obviously an alliance with the US and the UK. So we're not sort of seeing that exactly yet, but I have heard a lot of talk about the Labor Party reaching out, especially to our neighbors in Southeast Asia and getting closer to them. So I do think that's on Labor's prerogative. And if I were to guess, there probably is a plan to find a way to dump AUKUS in the near future, especially if Donald Trump becomes more problematic and sort of that MAGA movement continues to grow in the US as well, because I think that Australians are going to look at the US with less and less trust as time goes by.
So, obviously, along with the international stuff, with looking a lot more towards Asia, you also were talking about taxes, and we have seen already, straight from the get-go, Labor's proposing this upping of the tax on people with superannuation over $3 million. So, it does look like Labor might possibly be willing to burn a bit of political capital to get some tax reform in. I can't remember if they blocked themselves from negative gearing changes this election. That was one of the things we talked about a bit.
Yeah. So, just a flashback to our video I think we made last year, the one outside Parliament House, right? We were sort of theorising about what Labor could do to with those housing tax reforms, and you were suggesting the idea that they sort of don't make a clear answer before the election, and then sort of just, and then obviously just go through with it once they get into power again. And I think that's what the Labor Party were actually trying to do for a while. They were saying things to the effect of, oh, that's not our plan. Our plan is this. You know what our plan is. It's not those changes. But I think Albo did get a bit spooked close to the election, especially with the narrowing of the polls, and pretty much just said straight up, like, yeah, we're not doing those things. We're not changing those things. That's not what we're doing. We've already ruled that out, et cetera, et cetera. So they pretty much removed that from any possible mandate that they have now to make those changes. And that's why I'm saying that maybe they could go to an early election on tax reform, because then they can gain the mandate a la John Howard 1998.
Because you're right. They now have that what would have been a first term majority now in their second term, don't they?
Yeah, they do. But they can only use that large majority on so much. They can only really use that on things that they promised. I know that they went back on the stage 3 tax cuts last term, but a lot of, especially News Corp commentators, have mentioned that this is a much bigger change that they do something with, say, the capital gains tax discount. So I think they would have to have some pretty big balls to come out midterm without going to an election first and say, all right, we're going to make these changes because, X, Y, and Z. But they could do it. Theoretically, they could do it.
So, before we talk about the Liberals, is there any other points of this term about the Labor that we want to talk about?
No, I think obviously the Labor Party have done, I think, a lot of what they could have done on the economy. They try not to spend too much on social programs, and they try to not rock the boat too much when it came to things like the HAF. That was, I think, a little bit underwhelming in my opinion, because they didn't want to seem like they wanted to go too radical, doing things like a massive government public housing construction program would have maybe seemed a bit too radical and might have spooked the private sector a bit too much. So I think the Labor Party have tried to make their first term really safe. They tried to be really safe in the first term, and it seems like that really has paid off for them.
And that's the problem, isn't it? Like, if we people like you and me who might want Labor to do some more radical stuff are kind of Labor's been rewarded handsomely for playing it extremely safe. So,
Yeah,
like,
that's
by
right.
what
Yeah.
indication would they want to not play it safe this term? Because if they play it safe this term, theoretically, it's going to give them another 94-seat majority.
Yeah, well, but Labor hacks have said to me before Labor got elected last election in the 2022 election that like the second term is where the Labor Party is really going to shine. So it could just be that like they are saving their more sort of radical agenda to the second term, but we'll just have to wait and see.
So let's talk about the Liberals, who obviously, I think I did the math. I think this is their worst result ever. This is worse than 1943 because you forget there's all the independents in Parliament
Right.
now. So they actually hold a lower share of seats than they did in 1943 when they were absolutely destroyed by John Curtin. So obviously, we know David Littleproud has survived a challenge to remain Nationals leader. Meanwhile, Susan Lee has been appointed as the first ever female leader of the Liberals and the first ever female opposition leader. I'll point that out as well. And I guess one of the first questions we're looking at the Nats. We'll talk about the Nats maybe in a bit later, but let's talk about the Liberals. Do you think Susan Lee will make it to the next election? Because it feels to me like she's sort of been set up there to sort of be there for about a year or two until the Liberals get their act together and then dump her for their real leader.
Yeah, I mean that's what everyone's saying. They're saying that like they've just sort of plopped in the woman when they know that they're not going to keep her for the whole time. I mean, if Albo goes to a surprise early election, maybe she will be there at the next election. But yeah, if Albo goes full term, I do think that they're probably going to knock her off and replace her with Andrew Hastie at some time during the term. I don't think she's very charismatic, Susan Ley. I think she comes across as not very strong, even perhaps weaker than Albanese. I'm not just saying that because she's a woman. That's just sort of the impression that I get of her. I don't think she's going to be a very effective opposition leader.
Can as a thing I think people haven't mentioned too much, can the Liberals learn anything from someone like David Crisafulli in Queensland on how to win elections? Or do you think Queensland was a unique case and David Crisafulli can't really help him on how to win a federal election?
Uh, I think it's a different situation. I do think David Crisafulli is, I guess, like a pretty likable person, and it does seem like the Liberal Party has a deficit of likable, charismatic figures in their sort of senior role in senior positions in the party. So yeah, I mean, getting the right person is a problem in itself, but I also think that with Queensland, at the very least, it's been a surprise for quite a while about why the Labor Party haven't been able to make inroads in state Queensland. But Australia is a big country. We have 6 states, we have 2 territories, and just finding someone who will appeal to that whole thing, not just like one state, not just one demographic of people, I think is quite difficult. And that's what the Liberal Party have been unable to do really since Scott Morrison was knocked off.
Well, that's where I possibly think whether or not someone, I don't know how popular someone like Tim Wilson is, who obviously just won Goldstein back. Like him and possibly Josh Frydenberg might look at the results in Goldstein and think maybe I can win Kooyong back. I don't know if those two figures possibly could be potential because they're sort of, I think they're more of the moderate wing, more of the potential like Malcolm Turnbull types. Question of how popular Malcolm Turnbull was.
Even if there is sort of a prominent sort of moderate leader, I'm not exactly sure how sort of the national right or the right wing of the Liberal Party are going to react to anything a moderate leader tries to do in terms of policy. So remember when Malcolm Turnbull was in power, they couldn't wait to get rid of him as soon as they put him in, basically. So they just hated him, and even like the mainstream media, like 2GB and stuff like that, was pointing fingers at him daily when he was leader. They weren't happy. They wanted him gone. So I just don't know how long a moderate can survive, especially as there's an attitude amongst a lot of Liberal voters that the Liberal Party can only win when they embrace conservatism.
it is true that historically, you had Snedden, who was the moderate, but then Fraser, the Conservative, won. You had Peacock, who was the moderate, but then it was Howard, the Conservative, who won. You had Turnbull, the moderate, and it was Abbott, the Conservative, that won. So you're right that theoretically it's presumably going to be someone from the Liberals' right faction that ends up deposing Labor. In fact, this is probably the first election in a while where the solid Conservative Liberal voter was punished, because normally they've often been rewarded at these elections, which is again another reason why it surprised me a lot with these election results.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
it also possibly feels like we're at a point now where even if Labor screws up and does really bad, is it possible that the Liberals won't be the beneficiaries and instead Labor will just lose their seats to independents? Like it seems like the road for the Liberals to governance. I just really struggle to see how they can even win in 28. Like, it feels like if Labor was to lose votes, they'll just go everywhere rather than to the Liberals.
Yeah, and I think also that's why the coalition is really worried about some of these independent candidates. They're really worried that they have to fight on more than one front, and that's just going to make it more difficult for them. But as for where the Liberal Party can go from here, even in terms of policy, I was on ChatGPT the other day, and I was trying to sort of figure out with ChatGPT possibly some kind of policies or ideologies the Liberal Party can get behind to sort of revamp their party and change their party. And pretty much everything that ChatGPT spit out were things either that the Labor Party were already doing, like things like cutting red tape and fixing sort of zoning laws for building more housing, right? Or there were things that the Liberal Party would never do anyway. They would surely replace their leader before they would ever do a policy like that. I can't give an example.
So I think we've basically pointed out that the Liberals are not going to win off the Abbott strategy. The strategy being hardcore opposition figures, really, attack. It feels like the strategy is more likely going to be the Howard 96 strategy, which is meeting Labor halfway, but say, we'll just do it better. Hope that Labor gets caught up in social issues, which is what happened. Keating, I think, lost a lot of political capital with the always talk about the Republic referendum in the mid 90s, and that's what Howard was able to sort of capitalize on. It's like, he's too focused on the Republic referendum, I'll be focused on the economy, and I think that was one of the main reasons that led him to a big win. So that's the strategy that Liberals will have to bank on.
I think usually the coalition strategy is wait until the Labor Party screws up, or wait until the Labor Party tries to be sort of too progressive and then just oppose it. And going back to sort of tax reform, I don't think the coalition are really ever going to suggest any kind of radical tax reform as part of their agenda. They're just going to wait until the Labor Party tries something with tax reform and then oppose it and just be the party of opposition, say this is going to ruin the economy, or this is going to ruin your retirement, et cetera, et cetera. That's always going to be their plan, and I think
it does feel like this is another election where the status quo has won, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't think. I think some people in my comments I was talking in a recent video of mine about how it feels like this election is sort of bringing back the two-party system. The two-party system has been once again entrenched, and they were sort of criticizing and saying independents did really well and stuff like that. But I do think that ultimately the status quo has remained. The Liberal Party are still clearly going to be the official opposition. The people are going to be taking note of how they're going to specifically oppose or support what Labor is suggesting in terms of a policy. So I think the Liberal Party, again, it will come down to what the Labor Party does and if they can sort of capitalize on weakness with the Labor Party's policies or agenda.
It is interesting to note that the Liberals currently only have 25 seats in the House, while the Nationals have 19. This is probably the most even split coalition we've seen in Australian history. But regardless, as we finish off, let's talk a bit about the next election, because you were mentioning earlier that you think this might be the first time we actually see a government go early since the 90s. You think we might have a 27 election or even a 26 election?
Well, yeah, it just depends on if the Labor Party does want to go big on tax reform, which again is something I keep on mentioning because pretty much every economist says this is what's necessary to fix the economic situations that we're in.
But every voter
So,
seems to just reject it every election we've
yeah,
had.
but Labor does have a massive opportunity at the moment because they have this massive majority. The Liberal Party is so weak. So this is the one opportunity for them to say, okay, let's build this massive tax agenda. Let's take it to an election to get a mandate, and let's do it early because these are issues that are pressing. We can't just sort of like wait around and let things get worse. Because, in my opinion, we talked earlier about immigration and how it didn't really seem to help One Nation too much, didn't seem to help the coalition too much. But I think going into the next election, immigration is going to become a much bigger issue as house prices keep on rising, especially when interest rates keep falling. House prices are going to once again skyrocket, and you're going to see once again that argument brought up by a lot of people. And I don't think it would just be like the right wing this time. It will be a lot of people saying like, this is the problem of too many immigrants in our country. There's too much demand on housing. And I think if the Labor Party doesn't go and do something on housing very soon, we're going to see the rise of anti-immigration sentiment, and this will help either the far right in One Nation or the right wing of the Liberal Party.
It will be interesting because obviously we've got the Victorian election at the end of next year, and I think that will be a big litmus test of where the public
Yeah.
is feeling on Labor
Yeah.
then. So it's interesting. So we'll see where it goes, whether or not we do actually get our first early election called. But besides that, do you have any final points you'd like to make before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think there's a possibility we might see also an early Tasmanian election this year. I think that the Labor Party in Tasmania were really just sort of waiting around to see how this federal election would go before they took the chance of possibly doing some kind of vote of no confidence in the very, very shaky Liberal Party in Tasmania. We haven't really mentioned how well the Labor Party have done in Tasmania in this federal election. It looks like there is a slim but possibility that the Liberal Party might only get one senator in Tasmania, and of course they've been completely kicked out of the state as well. So there's that. And then I also just want to finish off what I was saying earlier about the Greens and Anna Bant getting kicked out of Melbourne. It is a big sign that the Greens really do need to take a look at themselves and work out where they're doing. Larissa Waters was just elected this week as the leader of the Greens. I don't think she's the best choice as the leader of the party, and I'm not exactly sure what direction she's going to take the party in, but there was a clear indication that the Greens have not been effective, especially with that. I think especially with them blocking a lot of Labor's housing policies. Again, in that video that we did in May last year in front of Parliament House, I was saying that the public might be sort of sympathetic to the Greens doing this. It doesn't seem like that's really been the case. It seems like the Greens are really punished for that. So the Greens have to take a hard look at what they're going to do, where they probably will have the balance of power in the Senate. They'll have to look at exactly how they wield that power that they have and how they react to a lot of the stuff that the Labor Party is going to push forward this term.
All right, so I guess with that being all done, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. And I think I'll be talking with you, Eli, in about a year's time to see how Labor's gone in their second term.
Absolutely. And of course, I'll probably get you as a guest on my channel to talk about some things in the near future too. But this has been really fun, Solomon. Thanks for inviting me on here for this video. And yeah, very big election, very surprising election. And we're all sort of waiting around to see what Labor's going to do with this massive mandate.
As we see, Australian politics, like any other place, is an evolving story, and we always are keen to see what the next chapter brings. All right, with that being done, thank you for joining me, and I will see you guys all later.
Bye-bye.